Hello everyone and welcome back to another album review, and in this video I'm going to review NEGRO by Pink Siifu. This is a very interesting album from an artist who I previously haven't heard before. This is basically my introduction to Pink Siifu, who seemed like an artist that goes into an experimental side of hip-hop, but this album right here, his brand new release, seems to go into a bit of a different and more aggressive direction. And definitely the thing that made me interested about this album was the numerous and very interesting tags. You have genres like sound collage being thrown, experimental hip-hop, power electronics, noisecore, just harsh noise music, avant-garde jazz. And so I'm like, yeah, this is a very interesting album that it's probably worth checking out. Now this album was put back in early April, but for a long time there wasn't in the streaming platforms like Bandcamp or Spotify, etc. until a few days back, and I decided to give it a listen, and pretty much all of the elements that are contained with all of those different genres, there, and I was certainly worried how all of those genres being combined together, because there are lots of things going on with this album. So I was just curious how all of this was going to pan out and come out as a full thing. And I was also like concerned if I'm going to see all of those elements actually being placed or just being put in that sort of fashion, because just putting all of those tags together makes for a big mess where you don't really know if they're actually existing throughout this whole album or if it's just a very weird combination of different sounds that doesn't even come up to some of those statements. But I definitely saw all of those being part of this album. And let me tell you, this album is extremely chaotic. And at some times, yeah, it gets extremely distorted and very noisy. And the thing that is also very interesting about this album is that we're talking about a political hip-hop album which deals a lot with like racial issues with America, with black people and police brutality. And all of this is just conveyed with just pure raw emotions. The aggression you get with some of the vocals and some of the instrumentations with this album, it's definitely intense, and it definitely sets you up to the mood for something quite filthy and quite disturbing. And with this sort of aggression and raw emotions, I think the album makes a very good job of actually putting out this message and make it sound really loud and really important. So for me, the album definitely has some great elements when it comes to how it portrays a very critical message, especially when it comes to some racial issues. And I like the way it is portrayed. It is done with a lot of care and with lots of different passages, whether that has to do with some noisecore elements of extremely brutal punk music, or that has to do with a very nice set of different collages of like interludes and just people talking, or just some very absurd and abstract jazz elements. The album is definitely all over the place and it's extremely chaotic. And like I said, musically, this album is actually kind of hard to sit through if you're not that familiar with just really noisy stuff. This album will just come out as a huge bob of some really extreme sounds that some viewers might not handle as easily. For sure, you have some very experimental and noisy elements with bands like clipping, for example, but the difference with clipping is that they manage with their sound to create a very cinematic experience, and that some of the sounds, or like most of the sounds they use, are extremely pristine with some very nice textures. The thing with this album though is that it is extremely lo-fi, to the point where it is very hard to just distinct lots of the elements of like what's going on, with all of the sounds being chaotic and just being put together. And I've heard lots of noise projects, so I am familiar with noise music and how extreme and brutal it can be, and I can say that it comes up to par with lots of noisy stuff. Now, there's obviously a balance with some other moments where you get some other sounds with some other genres here and there, but when it gets noisy, it is extreme. Now, apart from all that though, as far as the album definitely has some great moments to it, and I like the way it just puts its message out with a very interesting and quite unique and different concept for the whole realm of just hip-hop music, with its experimentations and all of the risks it takes. When it comes musically, for me, there were definitely more to be desired. I like that the album is short and doesn't overstay its welcome. It is just 37 minutes long, but we're talking about 20 songs on this thing. And as you expect, some of them go for about a minute long. There are some other moments that go for 2 or 3 minutes, but those are not enough in my opinion. And so for me, I think we get lots of moments that could have been more fleshed out or handled differently. For me, this album contains lots of interludes, which the way they have been done, it's really good and it's very interesting. There are experimentations, there are interesting elements. It's not like they feel completely unnecessary, but for the most part they're just decent and not like some extremely just majestic or mind-blowing moments. For what they are, for the majority of the album, they work pretty well in the context, since some of them do not overstay their welcome. But for me, I would prefer if some of the moments in this album were more focused or more fleshed out, so that we would have a more compelling experience and an album that would still provide a very strong and a very heavy message, but without being that much of a mess of lots of different tracks. Because there are moments that I love a lot in this album, but are just way too short, and I would definitely like to see those ideas just having more to them, just not that ending this abruptly, and not just the entire thing feeling like a continuous, massive and chaotic song. Like, the album starts with a very solid intro, and then towards the beginning we get some of the very good moments with the track FK, which is separated in 2 different parts, and I love the first one with this very energetic and extremely distorted and chaotic noisecore elements. It feels like a pure and very industrial hardcore punk song, and I like the aesthetic of it. Whereas at the beat switch, at the second half, we get into a more laid back approach, which works fairly well. Definitely one of my favorite moments was the track We Need More Color. It is a quite abstract piece of like avant-garde jazz music with some vocals here and there, and the thing that really works for this song is that it feels like a complete song. It's 3 minutes and it just plays out with this idea and it just comes out really well. But then after this point we get into 3 sort of interludes back to back, with the tracks Black, Adam X Jaden, I Love You, and America KK, Try No Pork, which are okay songs, but there's just 3 interludes back to back. So after this point is where we get some tracks that I would hope that would just have the structure or just would go further like We Need More Color did. For example, there's the track Run Pig Run, a very nice idea but only 1.5 minutes long. I would like something more to it. One of my favorite moments is the track DEADMEAT, and then there is a quite short but very compelling Chris Dorner. Then towards the second half we get some tracks with features which are quite decent, but I don't really see them just play out or having their own part in those very short tracks. I definitely enjoyed Homicide, Genocide, I'll Die with Kamal. The other ones did not have that much to them, and towards the end I think we get some of the better moments with some of those tracks that are a bit more fleshed out. The track Steal From The Enemy is quite good, but it's still another occasion that I would love more from it. Then we have tracks like On Fire Prey, which is separated in like 3 portions. Thankfully all of those work really well. And then we have the quite messy track that also goes into lots of different directions in 4 minutes, with the track Black Pitha Code, NEGRO, Wisdom Cipher, which is a very chaotic and a very messy way to end this album. And you know, the thing with some of the longer tracks is that they don't come out with just one idea rather than just separate short ones, which is something that I've seen becoming a lot of like a big thing in recent hip hop. Like, take examples from artists like even like JPEG Mafia, or at some times Injury Reserve, or even take some more popular names. Like, this is something that we see a lot happening with artists like Kendrick Lamar, or with like Brockhampton, where they have all of those moments where you have constant beat switches. At some points they work, at some points I feel like they're kind of unnecessary. In the case of NEGRO, I think it is fairly balanced for the most part, but for me personally, this album would be even better if it was just cut into less tracks and just give a bigger emphasis in some of the bigger highlights in this thing. Some of my favorite moments come with some of the noisecore and hardcore punk elements, but like I said, it's all over the place. The album can be very abstract, messy, experimental, glitchy, that constantly challenges the listener. This is something that you can get in like a project of like JPEG Mafia or with Injury Reserve, but in the case of Pink Siifu with this album, it is definitely more noisy, more lo-fi, and much more chaotic. On the other hand, when it comes to the lyrical theme and the message, and with some of the various sort of like spoken word or with the avant-garde jazz elements, it feels like a noisier version of To Pimp a Butterfly. Also, some of the more laid back, very slow, glitchy jazz elements give me an impression of like I'm listening to an Earl Sweatshirt project, which even with some of the deliveries and the rapping, which goes into this sort of like offbeat spoken word thing, it gives me this impression. This album, in my opinion, could definitely have been better. It's not like a very out there or like a very mind-blowing thing, but for what it does as a final result, it is quite decent and it's pretty good. There could have been more to it though than just a big chaos, because even with some of the instrumentals, like I said, the volume is in a very weird level. I think like the whole mix is just hugely compressed to the point where it doesn't really sound as loud as I would prefer to. I think that the gain in the whole master and the mixing could have been a bit higher, because there are so many moments where I feel that some of the very distorted parts just cover a lot of like the energy that could have been brought and being even more just intense and apparent in some occasions, and like lots of the portions of the instrumentals just ended up being extremely lo-fi to the point where they're almost like missing. Other than that, this is a very interesting project. I am happy with the result, and if you want an album with just a very strong message perceived in raw emotions and filled with anger, this is definitely the album for you. I'm going to give NEGRO a 7- out of 10. What's your opinion on this album? Like it, dislike it, why, and what do you want me to review next time? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.